thrilled to have on Christine Negroni. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Former correspondent for CNN, ABC, and now you are an author of a book called The Crash Detectives, which to me is so exciting. When did you start to think, I'm going to write a book on plane crashes? When did the thrill of knowing about planes and investigating them start? Because you're not a pilot.
No, and I know people will look at me and say, you know, you seem like such a nice girl. Why do you want to be the disaster queen? This is actually my second book, my second aviation safety book. My first book was about an airplane crash in 1996 that was of great interest in this part of the country. Well, it was
Flight
great
800
interest.
you're talking
TWA
about.
Flight 800. And so I wrote that about one specific accident, and then because I am the safety consultant for ABC News, I happened to be asked by ABC to go out to Malaysia and help them with their coverage of the disappearance of Malaysia 370. And at that time, I actually was toying with an idea of a second book, and Malaysia 370 happened, and I, sort of made sense to me to write a book about Malaysia 370, which then launched me into other aviation mysteries. So that's the little nutshell story about.
Let's talk about
detectives.
the nuts and bolts of looking at a crash. A lot of planes now, of course, are autopilot. You bring it in, but you also have the human factor involved in this. So it takes human factor, autopilot, circumstances beyond your control. Crashes happen. Then you all arrive, dissect it to see what happened. Let's talk about the Malaysian crash.
Well, about Malaysia specifically?
Sure.
Okay. So in the case of Malaysia 370, I put forward in my book a theory about what I think happened on the flight deck to cause that flight to go awry. So brief recap, it was taking off from Kuala Lumpur, it was headed to Beijing, and then somewhere after about, I think, 40 minutes into the flight, it went dark. There was no radio transmissions anymore, there was no communication between the airplane, even the automated transmissions between the airplane and the ground. They stopped, the transponder stopped, and then the plane turned around and headed back towards Malaysia, and then not to Kuala Lumpur, not to Penang, not to the places where it might have gone had there been an emergency, but just sort of weaved its way up, over, and then headed south with no further turns until it ran out of fuel. So it was a ghost flight, essentially, for 7 hours, and I create a theory about what I think happened on the flight deck.
Which is?
Well, for the full
Don't
details,
give too much away, because
exactly,
you want to buy the book.
And the reason it sounds like I'm being coy, I'm not really being coy about why I don't want to go into great detail about it, but part of it is because it's a little complicated. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts you have to understand the theory. But very simply, I base what happened on the flight deck of Malaysia 370 on an event that happened in 2005 in which pilots took off on their way from Cyprus to Athens. They failed to pressurize the airplane. That means they failed to make sure that the plane was being pressurized, more pressure as the plane goes up in altitude. You have to have a pressurized aircraft or there won't be sufficient oxygen for you to stay alive. So these pilots forgot to do that or neglected to do that, or for some reason the plane wasn't pressurized, and they fell unconscious, and everyone on the airplane fell unconscious, and the plane continued on autopilot until it ran out of fuel and crashed into a mountain. So there are significant differences, but there are, I'd say, very significant similarities in the behavior of both of those airplanes. And so I looked at that theory, and then I investigated some of the issues on Malaysia 370 before it went missing, some of the known fault mechanisms on an airplane that could have happened to Malaysia 370. And in broad strokes, that's my theory about what happened to Malaysia 370. Not a hijacking, not a taking over of the airplane electronically, not a flying it off to Diego Garcia. Something more simple than that, a known failure mechanism.
When we sat down, I love this. This is from Captain Sully Sullenberger. Negroni is a talented aviation journalist who clearly understands the critically important part the human factor plays in aviation safety. When you look at, and we should say that you're part of the International Society of Air Investigators. Mm-hmm. How do you go about digging in to the investigation of a crash when you get on site? What starts to happen?
Well, the kind of crash investigations that I have done are more from a journalism perspective, or as an investigator using the public information. Because for the 8 years I spent as an air safety investigator for an aviation law firm, which is a law firm that represents people who've lost someone in an air disaster, they don't actually get to go out and touch the metal in an airplane crash. They can only use the information gathered by the investigator. So let me just say that as a caveat. I've never been to an airline disaster.
Would you
and
like
been
to be on
kicking
site,
the tin.
though?
Well, I have been on small air accidents when my law firm represented people in private aircraft. So yes, I've seen them and I've been to them, and of course when I wrote about TW800 I had the opportunity to visit the wreckage several times. But you know, the general process is to simply do just like a reporter, and so I think you're going to recognize this. You just go out, you sort of get the diameters of the physical evidence, and then you start seeing where everything goes. The maintenance records, you take a look at them. Who was on the airplane? Who serviced the airplane? You take a look at them. You talk to them. What's everything you know about the last X number of days of this airplane, about the last X number of days of this person, the pilot or the flight attendant or the gate agent or anyone who had any relationship to the airplane, and you gather information. So I would say that an investigation of an air disaster, like almost any investigation, is a process of asking questions and seeing what those answers take you to. Because those answers take you to the next question and the next question until things start to gel.
As a member of the public, when a plane goes down, and we start to put the pieces together of it, and then days later, months later, we start to hear what caused it, how much does politics play into that, do you think?
Well, politics plays a larger part in it than I thought 10 years ago or 15 years ago when I wrote my first book. I really did believe that air safety investigators and the NTSB, in the case of TW800, were just these good guys who sat around and went where the evidence took them, and it was all black and white. But I have to say, when I started working on Malaysia 370, and then I started looking at other mysterious air accidents, and there are many in this book, I started to see how sometimes what seems to be factual is seen through a less than objective eye, that people tended to listen to the experience perhaps of an airplane manufacturer that maybe gave them too much weight. Or in the case of Malaysia 370, there's a satellite company that knows all about the triangulation of satellite signals, and who really can question what they say, because it's kind of a dense and obscure subject. So I felt a little bit more like I was growing up when I wrote this book, because there were instances where air crash investigations, I think, were manipulated to come up with an end that was less than conclusive, and the evidence is in the book.
Right. Where do you sit on a plane? Do you have a favorite place where you sit that you think is the safest?
Yes, absolutely. Well, not the safest. Now, I wanted to answer that question before you said the safest. Where do I sit on a plane? By the window. Because I love flying. I absolutely love flying, and I love being able to. Of course, I feel safe, and I love being able to look out and see. Really, we have been 100 years flying. For the history of humans, for 100 years only, have we actually been able to see the world from that perspective. So I never miss an opportunity to do that.
Safest place on a plane? Do you believe there is
no,
one?
I don't actually believe there's a safest place on the airplane, because every accident is different.
Sure.
And therefore the impact forces are going to be different. And where you may be safe in this kind of an accident, you won't necessarily be safe in that kind of an accident. I would say all of the devices and innovations that have gone into airplane design that we have in 21st century airplanes should absolutely make us safer. We just need to use them, like seat belts, and we need to make sure that our seat backs are upright when we land and when we take off, and the tray tables, because these are things that, when left down, would impede our ability to get off the airplane if we needed to get off in a hurry.
So you would tell people to sit down and watch the video.
Absolutely.
Stop
absolutely
fiddling with your phone and actually pay attention, because that could save your life.
Yeah,
when most of us are not paying attention to
No, I mean, and it's kind of weird, isn't it, Anne? Because people are both afraid of flying and blasé about their own role in their safety. It's a disconnect I don't really understand. Well, I guess I kind of do, because people will say, those kids are texting and driving. But then they'll be texting and driving. So I guess there is sort of a, I can do it and it's okay, but they can't. Really, someone who is texting and driving is in much greater chance of getting hurt than someone in an airplane.
Sure.
So, so I guess our ideas of risk are a little bit distorted.
Did you ever think that you would find yourself in this role in airline investigative, about safety after doing so many stories? First you started, we should say, here in Connecticut.
Yes.
And then went to the network. Did you think that this was going to be a chapter 2 life
no,
for
it's
you?
it's kind of interesting that I wound up in air safety, because I would like you and lots of other television reporters started off doing whatever my assignment was, whatever the assignment editor gave me in the morning. And after a while, I worked my way into legal reporting when I was at Channel 3, and then I went off to Chicago and I covered City Hall in Chicago, which was in itself an interesting assignment. So I did, find areas, then learned more about them, and in some ways it's kind of an intellectual economy. Once you've learned about something, it's all in there, so it makes it easier to write about the next
to use
time.
That old-fashioned term.
Exactly, absolutely. And my mind now, it's funny, I gave a lecture in Hong Kong recently, and I said, I have this Rolodex of airplane disasters in my head, and I thought, that's a grisly thing to say, but they probably don't know what a Rolodex is anyway. That's such an old-fashioned term. So, but yeah, you have those things you can rely on, and it makes it easier. So when I sat down to write The Crash Detectives, I have to say it was a lot easier than writing my first book, Deadly Departure, because that was new for me. And everything I wrote, I had to go back and check and ask and research. Now, of course, I know 50% of I knew 50% of what was in the book before I started to write. So to some extent, I've maximized what I already knew. What
are things over these many years that you've been investigating that you can tell us about what we need to know when we see a plane goes down? I mean, you can't jump to conclusions. You just can't, because pieces have to be brought together. But what are there things that you can tell the public about when they first see a report of a crash?
Well, I hate to sit in a television station and say this, Anne, but I would say, don't believe what you see on TV. And if Malaysia 370 wasn't a perfect example of that, I mean, the nonsense we saw, could it have flown into a black hole? I mean, truly, it was abysmal. And, I say that having worked for ABC at the time, and they were fantastic. So I just said I was going to say, don't believe what you see on TV, but I have to say, at the risk of sounding like I'm advertising for ABC's job, and what they brought me in to do, was so remarkable. They said, just sit here and tell us how to report this story. I mean, not obviously they know how to report the story, but what are the questions we should, be asking, and did those answers make sense? And would we be backstop our reporting? Basically, that's what they asked me to do, and it's not just on Malaysia 370. That's my job for them, and I have to say that's the way it should be done. But it so very often isn't.
In this time of social media, though, with Twitter and 140 characters, and it's instant, what happens is word goes out and it becomes fact, and it's not fact, and then here we go. So as an investigator, it's really hard to pull all that stuff back that's not true, that people already start believing.
Well, interestingly, in the United States, the National Transportation Safety Board, which is the agency that investigates aviation accidents here in the States or in other countries if an American aircraft is involved, they tweet the facts as they come in. So you asked, the question was, what should people, who want to know what's going on after an air disaster? I'd say go to that source. In other words, instead of following your Uncle Joe who was a pilot and claims he knows everything, follow NTSB on Twitter, because they're going to be tweeting out the facts, as they gather them in. That's part of it. Is like, be judicious about who you trust and who you don't. Just because somebody, and this is also, as a journalist, I know you probably recognize this, before you would tweet something out, you would know.
Check a source or two
whether
or three.
It was likely to be true.
Right.
But there's a lot of that on Twitter. It's like, did you just say that? Because where did you get that from? That's completely wrong. But many people don't have a journalism background, and they just sort of, maybe it's this and maybe it's that. There is a lot of that.
How has airline safety changed in the time that you've been investigating it?
Well, in the time that I've been investigating, I'd say, I've come into the tail end of what I think is the second half of the second third, of aviation, because we're about to start on a new third. But let's say the first third was, there's something wrong with the machine. I mean, we were just learning, from the Wright brothers on through the 50s and 60s. We were really learning about airplanes and how they fly, and then we changed from props to jets, and of course that was a whole new learning curve, and you know, the machine was baffling. And over the years, the machine has just gotten better and better and better. And I mean by that both the airplane and the engines. But now we've come to a point, I'd say probably in the 90s, where the 80s and the 90s, where the machine was pretty darn reliable, but the human was making a lot of mistakes. Now, how do we fix that? And that's the human factors that that Sully talks about in my book. That, you know, that's the new black for aviation safety is, how do we deal with the human, the lovable, fallible human? And that's, you know, that's the second third. Now here, what's the third? You'll say, well, there's the machine, there's the human, what's the third? The third is automation. And you mentioned that in the beginning when you started to talk to me. The role of automation, the role of digital technology in the aircraft is a whole new ball game. So the human, who we've been trying to sort of figure out ways that we can catch the mistakes of humans, trap them, they call them, and sort of prevent them from making mistakes, or at least protect them when they do. Now it's changed entirely, because they're not just dealing with the machine, now they're dealing with a technology they may not understand, or a technology that lulls them into complacency. Here's an example. The last time you needed to call someone, did you take the phone number right out of your head, or did you have to go to your phone and look it up?
The latter.
Yes. Why? Because we no longer, we export this what we used to have in our brains, we've exported it to our devices. Well, pilots are exactly the same. They've exported a lot of the things that they used to do to the airplane. But what happens if in a hurry something goes wrong and now you need to spring back to action? You have that delay of trying to, you know, figure out where's that data and how do I react to it. So that's the new thing. That's the new, I think we're going to see lots more of that in air safety.
That's interesting, because when I get in the car and I have to go somewhere, I just set the GPS and I just watch that. I'm not paying attention if I'm going left or right or north or south, and you do get used to it. God forbid you have to go back to instruments and fly a plane.
Right, but haven't you ever had it happen where the GPS took you the wrong place? And didn't you say, well, wait a minute, I've been here before. How did I make a wrong turn there?
Then I'm trying to find a map out of the glove compartment if I still have
exactly.
it. Right?
But the point is that the machine can, or the computer can lead you astray. Maybe you've programmed it wrong. I'm not blaming the computer. Maybe you programmed it wrong, or maybe there was some sort of cloud passing overhead. Who knows? But whatever. It's not infallible. The machine, the automation is infallible. So we've suspended our monitoring function. That is, we're not monitoring. The GPS says go right at the next turn, and you think, wait a minute, I've been here 10 times before, it's a left. You're not monitoring anymore, you just go right. That's the issue. And truly, you know, I think we talk about next books. My next book, I think, is going to be this. I'm going to jump right in.
Well, that was going to be my question too.
I just realized I've taken charge, forgive me. But my next book is what have they learned in aviation that we can use in our personal lives? Because that interface, which the human and the automation, the human and the computer, there's a whole lot of lessons for us in that. What about how we communicate or how we make decisions? This is a science in aviation. It's not a science that when you're arguing with your kid and you think, how did I get into this argument? But if you think about how you communicate, as they do in aviation, you may fight with your kids less or your spouse less.
So what's chapter 1, do you think, in the third book?
Well, the chapter 1, I think, would be the argument I just made. What does aviation safety have to teach you about performing better? And I think people would say, what? No, what could it be? Well, and the answer is lots of things. Decision making, communication. But when you hop in your car and you plug the GPS in and you say where you're going to go, do you check to see how much fuel you have in the tank, or whether your headlights are working, or whether you brought the stuff you're going?
I assume it's all working.
See?
Problem.
But pilots do a pre-flight, and they make sure. And after they come home, they say, did I do that right? Is there a better way I could have done that next time? We could do that, and we'd perform better.
So bottom line is, we still have to have conversations, and we still have to pay attention.
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
Christine Negroni, thank you so much. The book is Crash Detectives, and I can't wait for the third one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Made a trivial pursuit Since when will this end? Who's this girl I spend all night kissing? And the bumper's right here, then who else is missing? Got a little sidetracked if I'm so wishing to find the keys to the door, but it's also a metaphor. Need to keep locked in the grocery store of my mind. Just to save time, skip right ahead to the last ride.